I'll say that again. So thank you all for coming to Fernanda Krupek's Ph.D. defense in the room and online. I'm really just beginning to welcome you all here. So there's many things that I could share about Fernanda. I want to give her the floor sooner than later, so I'll try to keep it brief. So Fernanda started her PhD program here in May of 2019, which is about a year and a half after I started. And she has just been so integral to our team. She has set such an excellent example. She has supported and mentored others on our team. Oh, I didn't think I was going to get emotional with that. She's produced such excellent research. She's spoken about her work. She's been asked to do that many times. She's served in the department and in many of the professional societies doing service. So that's just a little bit about how integral she's been to me and our team. That's the first thing that I want to share, that it's really hard to imagine our group without her, but she has exciting things planned next, which I'll share shortly. So she'll tell you a little bit about herself and background. I could share all the many awards that she's gotten, all the services she's done, but I think as she presents, you'll get a feel for her work and accomplishments. And so the work that she's done has been primarily on-farm research. And this project that she's come into was complicated. There was a lot of people to coordinate, a lot of different experimental designs. It required a lot of complexity in her analysis and statistics. I can say with certainty that this project would not have been nearly as successful if not her creativity, her ambition, her time management, her communication skills. She just had excelled from the start. And I want to just add, this is, I think, a celebration of great work, and her work is not only excellent, but it's really important, right? That I feel that our mandate as a research community at land-grant university researchers is to help producers, students, and stakeholders to support farming practices that conserve or improve their soil. Right now, as the climate changes, I think that this is more important work than ever, and her work will illustrate some of the valuable insights that we have gained about soil health. So, in fact, she will begin in a role as assistant professor at urban food systems horticulturalist at the Ohio State University's Department of Crop and Horticultural Sciences, where they're going to be so lucky to have her and her talents, and I know she's going to continue to do excellent work. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you again, Andrea. As a grad student, I couldn't be more thankful for finding not only an advisor, but an amazing mentor who inspired me so many different ways. So thank you so much for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Today, for those connecting online, thank you for being with us. I'll be honest with you, I can't believe it has been already 4 years since I moved to Nebraska to start this project. But as the saying goes, time flies when you are having fun and learning and growing, right? So I'm very thankful to be here today sharing with you all the learnings of this project focused on on-farm experimentation for sustaining soil health management in Nebraska. So this is work. As this is my very last presentation as part of my program here, I would like to start with sharing this first experiential learning opportunities in life and what inspired me this interest in our agriculture and our food system. So from coffee harvest to horse riding in a ranch in one of our in farm operation in Southeast Brazil, to growing and harvest our own fruits and vegetables with my sister, having this opportunity to culture, different production systems and environment is what sparked me this interest in our agriculture. And I'm very thankful to all the mentors who paved the way by sponsoring me to engage in research, teaching, and extension. And if you ask me to represent the last 10 years of this pathway in a piece of paper, this is what I would bring you. As you can tell, I need to improve a lot of my drawing skills, but I like to share this with you because this was part of an activity I was part of the Preparing Future Faculty program here at UNL. And at the end of this activity, we had to work on our why statement. So thinking on our why rather than our what. And what we really want in a better world for those that we serve. And this is my why: to explore opportunities for advancing practical knowledge and technical skills so that leaders are equipped to promote sustainable food systems. So hopefully, you are going to see this why throughout my presentation today, as this has been the underlying motivation behind all the work that I have been doing over the last 4 years. So this is what for us. I will start with a brief introduction, bringing explaining some terminologies here to make sure we are all on the same page. And then I will focus the majority of the presentation on 4 different studies. One that encompasses the majority of the farms that were part of this project, 10 farms. And other 2 studies where we looked at a subset of 4 farms. And those we used to frame soil health metrics relative to reference sites and also look at carbon nitrogen dynamics. And finally, a last study where we look more at the human dimensions of agricultural decision making. So if you were here 3 weeks ago, I presented part of this study in our seminar here in this room. And finally, some summary, what we have learned and how that might support your work. So some of you might have been already familiar with this terminology. Just trying to see up. Okay, so some of you might have been already familiar with this terminology of soil health, which emphasizes soil functioning, right? So you are seeing this picture one of the very first times in Nebraska. You see a fence line separating 2 different managements. On the right-hand side, you see some water on the surface here, which might be an indicator that that soil in that portion of the field might be functioning as we would expect in regard to water cycling. But it's the same soil, right? Just different management on the right and left-hand side. So the point I want to make here is that soil has its context, its inherent capability, and the way we manage and the land we use on top of it is its function expression of its health. And there are some other related concepts when we think about soil health. So for example, soil fertility, soil quality, which is the historic origin of the term soil health, and also soil security. All those related concepts, they bring the importance of soil in our society, ecosystems, and also agriculture. And if we look at soil health, term is the one that encompasses here a broad aspect in terms of function, services, and actors that are important for sustainability goals. And how on all those conversations, especially in our agriculture ecosystem, those conversations in terms of ecological intensification of our farming systems in soil health as central as part of the discussion, right? I think that goal of balancing food production and the environmental impacts of our agriculture system is something that all of us in this room might be trying to achieve that goal, right? And soil health has been central in those conversations, especially because of the potential that microorganisms have to enhance ecosystem services and also deliver ecosystem services simultaneously. So how do we start with widespread adoption of those soil health management practices? The first thing is the awareness of those systems, right? And you see here, farmers, the central players, the ones taking management decisions on a daily basis, right? The awareness needs to come here. And I just want to thank you, the farmers who are in this room with us today and those connecting online. Having this opportunity to work with them as part of this project gave me even more appreciation for the work they do. So we need to start with the awareness here, right? And what are some of management systems? Well, NRCS has put together a list of principles of soil health that can hopefully guide us some management decisions here. So for example, practices that maximize biodiversity, like crop rotation, organic amendment, crop and livestock integration, practices that minimize soil disturbance, like the use of no-till, and maximize soil cover and continue leaving roots with the use of cover crops. I just want to emphasize this list here is a non-exhaustive list, meaning that there are many other practices, right, that can support soil health, but the ones we will be talking about as part of this project focus majority on the ones that you were seeing. Okay, so from awareness to initial use, there are some tools that have been used to encourage or promote farmers' conservation behavior. For example, through conservation incentive programs, we know that USDA is a leading funder of programs that support adoption of soil health promoting practices, and also through on-farm experimentation and adaptive management. So having farmers testing different management systems in their fields, adapt and learn from it. And including farmers as central on the research component, has been very beneficial, and we see a lot of more recent research trying to understand what are the factors that explain our factors that brings more successful collaborative research. So you are seeing here a couple of factors, for example, having mutual beneficial goals, sharing ownership of the research process, building trust. Those are things that make collaborative research successful, especially when we are talking about including farmers, extension, conservationists as part of the research process. And farmers adopt those systems because they expect some outcomes, right? That can be profitability, drought resilience, resource use efficiency, that are different outcomes that we can expect. But from a single management, we cannot expect the same outcome because there are some intervening factors. Those are climate, geology, duration, soil texture. That's why from a single management, we cannot expect the same outcome. But how can we link management to outcome? That's where assessment comes into play. So looking at those physical, chemical, and biological properties to link a management to an outcome. And I just want to emphasize here that those physical, chemical, and biological indicators, they are not an end to themselves. It's just a means of translating a system to an outcome. And on that translation, timing is very important. So you're seeing here results of a recent meta-analysis that look at how different physical, chemical, and biological properties responded to 1, 2, and 3 years of cover crop adoption. So all the indicators that are above this dashed lines means properties that were more responsive to cover crop management. So that's why timing here is very important, right? And more specifically, continue use of those management systems, sustaining that management system over time, because we are not talking about a return on investment. So those practices accumulate benefits relatively slowly over time. That's why continued adoption of those practices are important, so farmers are able to obtain short and long-term outcomes. And what are some of the pathways that promote this continued use? Well, in the literature, there has been more studies trying to understand what are the possible pathways for that persistence. And you see here how social influence takes a role in that. So all those social norms and culture supporting conservation behavior. So this is all to set the stage for the overall objective of the research integrated with extension. You're interested in understanding how soil and human dimensions considerations impact farming systems for sustaining soil health management in Nebraska. So you see a couple of things I highlight here, just mentioning that we are focusing on those two components of that framework, on those physical, chemical, and biological properties, and the farmers here, understanding more the human dimensions of agriculture decision making. So before I move to each of those 4 projects that I want to share with you, if you can please take the time, scan this QR code, and it will take you to a question. I know we are in a very broad and diverse audience here today, so I was wondering how often are you considered a source of advice regarding issues surrounding soil? So I'll take a few minutes here so you can answer the question, and I will show you all the results. We're getting some answers, sometimes very often. Right. Yeah, thank you all for answering. So it seems the majority, they never very often. So I think regardless of whether we work with a specific crop or a specific production system, we are often sources of advice regarding issues surrounding soils, right? So I hope that what I'm presenting here today might be something that you can apply to your work. So I hope by this time you understand that it's not a prescription, but a pursuit, right? And on that pursuit for healthier soils, farmers and stakeholders have very different practical questions. And there are 4 main questions that we are attempting to answer this project. First, how soil management influence properties on farm available soil health assessment. What are the attainable gains in soil health, particularly here with cover crops? And what are some of the sampling strategies that we employ? how carbon and nitrogen content within soil organic matter respond to management changes. And finally, the human dimension aspect I showed you, how social and informational networks influence farmer sustaining adoption of soil health promoting practices. So let's start with this first question. And I want to point out that all the soil data that I'm presenting here today came from this UNL NRCS Soil Health Initiative on-farm experiment. So this was a collaboration between UNL On-Farm Research Network, NRCS, and farmers in Nebraska. So in 2016 and 17, a total of 17 studies were assigned, and farmers were part of this 5-year on-farm research and demonstration on soil health management. So farmers were under 8-week contract with NRCS, and they had a chance to choose the management comparisons that they were interested in trying in their field. So usually a practice that was common to them, and another practice that was intended to improve soil health. So in general, all those types included cover crops in some capacity, but some included different species comparisons, others grazing or crop rotation. And for this first study, we looked at 10 out of those 17 farmers that were part of this initiative. And as you see here, there was a wide range in terms of treatment comparisons that were part of those on-farm sites. So cover crop species, also crop and livestock integration, cash crop rotation. And when we start talking with farmers and trying to understand more the history of those types, we also realized that there was a lot of difference in terms of adoption of cover. Some of those types, they were testing cover crops for the very first time. Other types, they have been using cover crops for over 12 years. And the same applies, for example, to tillage. Some sites, they were under strict tillage. Other sites, they have been under no-till for over 20 years. So as you can imagine, this brings a lot of complexity on how, when we look at this data and try to understand what is the biological meaning behind all of this, right? So one way that we decided to make sure we are comparing apples to apples when we look at all those sites was to develop these indexes for classification of ecologically intensified cropping systems. So basically putting each of those on-farm sites in a scale from less to more ecologically intensified in terms of crop diversity, years of cover crop use, years without soil disturbance, organic amendment, and crop and livestock integration. And we apply this classification index in a subsample of physical, chemical, and biological properties that you are seeing in this table here. The majority of those properties, they came from the DHS, which is the commercially available soil health that tries to incorporate a greater pool of carbon and nitrogen in the soil, those that are more microbially available. For example, this water extractable carbon nitrogen, and also more direct measurements of soil biological activity or microbial activity under standardized conditions. And we also see here at the end these Haney calculations that are part of this study. Those are still evolving, those calculations. But the ones we are presenting here were part of what WorldClad was offering. And in terms of nutrient recommendations, both for corn and wheat that I'm going to show, those are based on calibrations from UNL and also Kansas State University. So we applied that classification index on those physical, chemical, and biological properties. And the first step was to run multiple linear regression models. So to understand how, when we consider all those indexes simultaneously, how they drive change on those properties. And the second step on that analysis was to calculate what you are seeing here, this variable contribution. So out of the results on those linear regression models, what percentage of that variability was explained by each of those indexes? So I want to highlight here those properties that try to capture greater pools of carbon and nitrogen in the soil, the ones you are seeing here. Look at how cover crop use has explained the majority of variability on those soil properties, ranging from 39 to 70%. And when we average across all physical, chemical, and biological properties, we saw that cover crop had the greatest weight on driving changes on those properties, followed by all those other indexes. And I'm not saying here that cover crop is more important than the other practices, right? But this index that we use to represent continued living roots in the system was the one that helped to explain most of the variability on those soil properties related to carbon nitrogen dynamics. And because of that, we took a closer look on those calculations and their relationship with cover crop use. So let's look at this first graph here. You are seeing this relationship between soil test biological activity, which is the 24-hour CO2 respiration. Others might call it mineralizable carbon, which is essentially a measurement of microbial activity under standardized conditions. And you see here the relationship with this soil test predicted nitrogen release. This is a calculation from this Haney test that attempts to measure how much of that nitrogen is stored on that soil organic matter will be converted into inorganic forms like nitrate and ammonia, and will be available for the plant during the growing season. So agronomically, a very important piece of information. And that calculation takes into account two main things. First, the substrate, and the other one, the activity. So this relationship here, we were already expecting linear relationship because they use this soil respiration to calculate that predicted nitrogen release. But what was most interesting is that farmers adopting cover crops for over 8 years, which is represented by those bigger circles here, were the ones that had highest soil test biological activity, consequently higher nitrogen release. And when we look at nutrient recommendations both for corn and wheat, those were the ones that had the greatest reductions in fertilizer application. And when we calculate this hypothetical nitrogen savings, which is essentially the difference in nutrient recommendation if we consider standard chemical analysis and this Haney test, we see that farmers adopting cover crops longer periods of time had greater savings in nitrogen. And this is something that more advanced farmers have reported, right, in terms of nutrient reduction when adopting cover crops in the long term based on the cover crop surveys, national surveys that have been in place for over the last year. So what we have learned, first, cover crops had the greatest impact on change in soil properties that were closely related to carbon nitrogen dynamics. The greater the number of years with continuous soil cover crop adoption, we saw greater values of soil test biological activity and predicted nitrogen release, which produce fertilizer recommendations and provide economic savings. Again, when we include these organic nitrogen pools in nitrogen fertilizer recommendations. So let's move to our second study, where we're interested in looking at what are the attainable gains in cover crops, in soil health with cover crops, and what are some of the sampling strategies. On the study, the first objective was to apply the concept of soil health gap that I'm going to explain in the next slide, relative to reference soils, and understand what are the attainable gains in soil health with cover crops. And the second objective to understand soil property combinations and sampling strategies that maximally distinguish soils with a perenniality gradient. So basically for this study, we selected a subset of 4 of those on-farm experiments. And the reason we selected those is because all of those, they had a cover crop versus a no cover crop mix as part of the no cover crop control. And in addition to those 4 cover crop and no cover crop on farm experiments, we also selected what I'm calling here reference sites. Those were grassland sites, minimally disturbed fields that accounted both for soil and also climate variability within each on-farm trial. And if we look at the plant species on those reference sites, and if we bring the state and transition model, which is used in rangeland health, we can classify each of those reference sites in terms of where they are on the state and transition model. So for example, Greeley and Howard, they were on the native invaded grass, Merrick, switchgrass, prairie and reed, and Colfax in native invaded mixed estate. So this aspect of soil health gap is something that others in our department have been working on. So you see here this nice diagram from Dr. Maharjan work. The idea is we want to understand cropland function compared to our native potential, right? And in our study, we calculated this relative soil health, which is essentially a ratio between the soil property values for the cropland type, those under cover crop and no cover crop, and the reference soil. So this is what we use to calculate this relative soil health. And the second aspect is in terms of sampling intensity, right? You were that in each of the sampling points that we selected within the on-farm site, sampling it here every 4 to 5 acres, first considering soil type on those on-farm sites, we measure up to 5, we had up to 5 repeated measurements of water infiltration. So here to try to understand how many samples or measurements we need to collect in the field. And in terms of sampling, that was near surface soils that was sampled in summer 2019, which represents 3 years after the initial on-farm experiment on those 4 sites. And on the cropland sites, all on-farm plots, they had, when we sampled, they were around soybean growth stage R6. So let's look at the results. You are seeing here the relative soil health, which is essentially the ratio that I mentioned before between the cropland and the reference site. And you see 6 different soil properties here. Those properties usually follow the more the better pattern, meaning that if we sum all of the 6, we will get to the level of the reference site, which is what you are seeing here, this dashed line number 6. So when we look across all those 4 sites, we see that cover crop was higher than the no cover crop and trending towards the level of that reference site number 6 here. In some places, they were significant different, like Greeley and Colfax, where we saw that cover crop reduced that gap in soil health by 28 and 55%. And in other 2 sites, it was not significant, but we still saw cover crop trending towards the level of the reference site. In terms of soil properties, we see here those asterisks means that there were significant difference between cover crop and no cover crop for each of those sites. And here, when we look across all 6 properties, we saw the water infiltration was the most responsive. So being significant different in 3 out of the 4 sites. In terms of sampling strategies, I know there is a lot of information going on in this graph, but I just want you to focus on the big circles here, which essentially represent each of those 3 management: cover crop, no cover crop, and reference. So look how those overlap more or less if we move from 2 repeated measurements of water infiltration, 3, 4, and 5. So we see here a lot more overlap among those three management compared to 5 repeated measurements of water infiltration, which here showing us that those differences between treatments represented by those ellipses increase with greater sampling intensity. So what we have learned as part of this project, reference soils can capture those trends in soil health potential across on-farm sites and characteristics, especially when we don't have long-term soil health management systems adoption, right? So identifying those reference sites are very important. In terms of cover crops, we saw that cover crops reduced that in soil health between managed and reference soils in the short term. Here we are looking at 3 years after first implementation of cover crop treatment. And finally, greater difference in initial water infiltration between reference and the no cover crop sites was observed in higher sampling repetition. Here, looking at 4 to 5 repeated measurements, sampling per soil type and replication every 4 to 5 acres and on those on-farm sites. All right, so moving to our third study, looking at carbon, nitrogen in soil organic matter. The first objective of this study was to understand how carbon and nitrogen associated with different soil organic matter fractions. And I will explain what those fractions mean in the next slide. but how they responded to 3 years of cover crop in annual row crop rotation compared to systems without cover crop, and also our reference site. And the second objective, to understand how those changes in soil organic matter fractions were related to other physical, chemical, and biological properties. So here looking at the potential of integrating those fractions in the soil health framework. In terms of sampling, it was exactly the same type that we used for study number 2. So those 4 types, testing cover crop and no cover crop, and the reference that we identified nearby the on-farm sites. So what are those soil organic matter fractions? I want to start here with a quick analogy that has to understand carbon, nitrogen, and soil organic matter. And big shout out here to Jordan Wade from the University of Missouri, who had told me to think on this, and it's very applicable to where we are. Lincoln, Nebraska, the home of our Cornhusker football team. We know that the population here in Lincoln, Nebraska, based on what I saw online, is about 296,000 people. And we have our Memorial Stadium, our legendary football Memorial Stadium football, and we know that the capacity there is about 90,000 people. So as you can imagine, or you might have experienced during game day, a lot of people coming from out of the town, right? Or even out of the state. And some people might decide to just stay a couple hours for game day. Some people might decide to stick around and stay longer, weeks, days, we don't know, right? But similar to carbon, nitrogen in soil organic matter. We just don't want to know what is coming for game day or what is leaving. We want to know what is sticking around for longer periods of time. And we want to make sure we measure those different groups of people. So what is soil organic matter? We know that our scientific society has experienced shifting paradigms in how we understand and quantify soil organic matter. And one of the most recent and emerging views consider it as a continuum of decomposition. So this idea of a river here, as you see in this figure. So plant compounds come from different sources, right? Like plant litter, microbial byproducts. And as you see here, depending on you are in this river, the rate of flow of those compounds, it goes fast, sometimes it goes slow. So essentially, we move from inputs, very complex molecules, chemically very different, and they get respired out as CO2, the microbes working in our soil, right? And essentially, if you look at very simplified way, this rate of inputs, rate of flow can change from input to output, can change based on a couple of different things. For example, those compounds can be taken up by microbes in the soil. We know microbes need nutrients as well, right? Those compounds can be stuck into the minerals in the soil, those positively and negatively charged particles in the soil. And finally, that those compounds can be physically protected in what we call aggregates in the soil. So looking at a very generalized way, this rate of flow from input to output is dictated by 2 main things. First, where those compounds stick to soil, and second, the efficiency of microbial uptake and incorporation into their biomass. And how do we measure this? How we have a measurement that represents these 2 main influences on the rate of flow from input to output? Well, in our community, we talk about particulate organic matter and mineral-associated organic matter. So particulate organic matter, usually low quality input that stay in the soil for shorter periods of time and has a relatively more carbon relative to nitrogen. And the mineral-associated organic matter, usually higher quality inputs, stay in the soil for longer periods of time, relatively lower carbon to CN ratio compared to particulate organic matter, and is more protected from microbes in the soil. So you can think about that as your checking and savings account, right? We want to make sure we have nutrients in the soil, so we are feeding the microbes and we are using our checking account, but we also want to build that soil organic matter over time and make sure we are accumulating and having our savings account. So this is what we did in the lab. You are seeing here all the experimental steps. When we received the soil samples and we dispersed the aggregates to separate those different fractions, the particulate organic matter, both free and inside aggregates, also the mineral-associated organic matter, and our water extractable organic matter. So we received the soil samples, we dispersed the soil aggregates using different techniques. For example, through ultrasound, as you are seeing here in this picture, Sophia, one of the undergrads working with us in this project, has been very helpful. We also did dispersion by wet sieving and shaping. So I brought a couple of samples here. You can go ahead and check. You can take those main samples look like. So essentially, we calculated carbon and nitrogen on those fractions. And for the sake of time, I will focus the results on the carbon results, but the trends we observed was very similar and applicable to the nitrogen. So you are seeing here, I know it's a lot on this figure, but let's go into detail. So you are seeing carbon concentration as a function of soil management, no cover crop, and reference for both bulk soil and all those fractions, particulate organic matter, both free and occluded, mineral-associated organic matter, and the water extractable organic matter on each of those four sites. If you look at bulk soil in general, reference height had an increase in carbon score on bulk soil that ranges from 28 to 38%. But we did not see differences between cover crop and no cover crop. As you see, they have the same ladder here, meaning there was no statistical difference between those measures. When we look at those fractions, soil management did influence carbon score on those fractions, but the responses were either site or fraction specific. So I'm giving you here a couple highlights on places where soil carbon is stored on those fractions that range vary from 38 to 76%. But again, we did not observe differences between cover crop and no cover crop. And our mineral-associated organic matter was the least responsive to management change. Well, a couple of things here why we do not see differences between cover crop and no cover crop on carbon score on those fractions. First, we are talking about very short time since the cover crop adoption on those sites. Here, 3 years of cover crop adoption. And also, when we look at biomass accumulation across all those sites, they were all below 3 megagrams per hectare. They're very low biomass production system, which might be affecting their results. We are seeing here no significant improvement with cover crop adoption. But remember that all those 4 sites, they also had other differences. They were all testing cover crop versus no cover, but they also had other differences in terms of field history, right? So this is what we are trying to understand in this next slide. We calculated the percentage change from reference soil. So looking again at that reference condition and what we did on this study number 2, we calculated this percentage change from reference soil for bulk and all the fractions. And we see that, for example, the highest decline in cropland carbon relative to reference soil for bulk soil was observed in non-irrigated sites under porous texture. The same applies to the free particulate organic matter. We saw greatest decline in non-irrigated porous texture soils. For the water extractable fraction, we see here irrigation playing a role with increase. The highest declines in non-irrigated sites in water extractable organic matter. And finally, mineral-associated organic matter, we see here tillage, the highest decline on cropland carbon relative to reference soils observed in sites under tillage. So here, understanding that carbon declines in cropland relative to reference soils were the highest under non-irrigated porous texture sites under tillage. And the second objective of this study, looking at the relationship between those fractions and other physical, chemical, and biological properties. This is what you are seeing in this graph here. Essentially, when arrows are pointing towards the same direction, means that they are highly positively correlated. So we see here how particulate organic matter, both free and occluded, were highly positively correlated with water infiltration, aggregate stability, enzyme activity, showing here the relationship between that fraction and other functions such as water tightening, soil aggregation, and enzyme activity. And the same for water extractable and mineral associated organic matter. We see highest correlation with cation exchange capacity in soil nitrate, and negatively correlated with both densities. So showing here the relationship with those fractions and nutrient retention in soil compaction. So what we have learned as part of this study, that potential of systems with increased perenniality, in our case, those reference types, they improve carbon nitrogen is stored within fractions, but we saw less pronounced cover effect, especially when talking about short-term adoption of those cover crop practices 3 years under low biomass production systems, and also forest texture and no irrigated sites, which brings us to some thinking on terms of modifications of pest management practices, for example, planting, termination, species selection, in order to boost soil organic carbon sequestration, nitrogen retention. And finally, those operationally defined fractions, the mineral associated organic matter, the particulate organic matter that you saw on those samples, they were related to other soil properties representing functions such as water infiltration, nutrient retention, erosion control, and below ground biodiversity. All right, our last study, I hope you are sticking with me. So we are interested in learning about the human dimensions of agricultural decision-making. So the main purpose of this study was to explore how social and informational networks influence farmers' use of soil health practices. For this, we are partnering with the faculty in the Agricultural Leadership, Communication, and Education and Communication Department, and we are working on this framework you are seeing here that incorporates different theories. Those theories are color-coded here, as you see in this diagram, which essentially trying to understand how humans make decisions. As you can imagine, a very complex topic, right? But you see here, as farmers' attitudes, general beliefs around soil health, their attitudes towards conservation programs, and you see here this persistence or this adoption, which is something that we are interested in understanding, right? Are farmers going to adopt those practices in the long term or not? And you see that there are different theories that we are exploring as part of this framework. There are different research questions that are driving us as part of this framework. This study, we are interested in two main theories. First is the diffusion of innovation, and the other one, value belief norm theory. The diffusion of innovation includes different aspects on how an idea or a technology is adopted. So just thinking when iPhone came out, right? There were some people that decided to adopt right away and try it, those innovators and early adopters, all the way to the late adopters and the laggards. So this is what we are interested in using diffusion of innovation, how that information gets diffused, especially here in the context of soil health promoting practice. And just give you an example how that has been. You see here the soil health cafe talks promoted by North Dakota State University. They worked on this really nice knowledge network map. So they hosted different meetings, those cafe talks, which are those blue squares that you were seeing here, and they were able to identify those extension scientists, farmers, crop consultants, government agencies, and industry representatives that were part of this network. And the second step was trying to see what are some of the most influential people as part of that group, right? Probably the ones that are in the center here of this network map. So this is in the context of use this diffusion of innovation theory. And the second one is the value belief norm theory. This theory tries to understand how our behaviors are actually part of some of values and beliefs that we hold. So for example, farmers that might be more risk averse, they might not be willing to try soil health management systems at least the first time, right? Compared to other farmers that might be considered more risk-based or risk averse. So this is what this theory intends to explain. And in terms of data collection and analysis, as you might expect, very different from what we are used to, right? Both from data analysis, collection. So you are seeing here in this slide, the main aspect in terms of data collection and analysis. First, this research needs to undergo approval by the institutional review board. In terms of samples, we are interested in interviewing farmers that were part of the soil health initiative after the 5-year soil health demonstration program. So we conducted semi-structured in-depth interviews in fall last year, which was at the end of that 5-year on farm experimentation on soil health management system. Those interviews lasted between 1.5 and 2 hours. And we asked several questions to farmers in terms of their credible sources of soil health information, knowledge exchange, their experience with on-farm research and conservation programs. So how we present the results? The results are presented in terms of themes. So what are the main themes that emerged out of those conversations? So I'm bringing here 5 different themes that were part of those conversations. First, land tenure. All those interactions between landowner and tenure at the interface of different motivations and beliefs related to soil health. We know that in the US, about 40% of the cropland involves some sort of landowner and operator relationship. So it's not surprising that land tenure was a theme that emerged out of those conversations. Also perceived acceptance, farmers' normative belief, what they think others would think of them, and their perception of acceptance within specific relationships was something that emerged out of that conversation. Also, family farming tradition. When we asked if practices they tried it or would like to try in their field, that connection with previous generations was part of the conversation. Also, co-learning, those educational approaches that involve shared knowledge on soil health, not only among farmers, but among farmers and other agriculture stakeholders were also part of this theme. And finally, on-farm experimentation and adaptive management. Farmers' involvement with on-farm research and learning and adapting from that was also part of that theme in this analysis. So what I'm going to do, for the sake of time, I will bring just some representative quotes for 3 out of those 5 themes. So you can have an idea what the farmers were mentioning on each of those themes. So let's start with perceived acceptance. So I like this quote here, the farmer mentioned, it's all about farming more ground faster, being the first in the field, the first out of the field. And this is a challenge, right? Especially when we are trying to adopt cover crops here in Nebraska, we have a very short growing window. How can we improve or how can we incentivize the adoption of those practices when we have this perceived acceptance that this farmer is describing here? And even more important, when we think about the future generation of farming communities, this is what this farmer was mentioned here. This other farmer, instead of saying perceived acceptance, called it, it's perceived as different and weird and bad. There is a cost of perception and it has a cost to me. And this farmer even brought some specific examples of practices. For example, no-till, how no-till crops might not look nice early in the spring, and how that has this cost of perception to them. And finally, interestingly, it seems that farmers with more integrative approaches like crop and livestock enterprises, it seems that that pressure is not as bad or as strong. So you see here, this farmer mentioned, we don't feel that pressure to go out in the field because we have livestock that is making this money. Also, co-learning, that shared knowledge. I like this quote here, and farmer mentioned how impactful those co-learning experiences can be, especially when involving one-on-one information exchange. And there is also farmers mentioning here the importance of early and local adopters, how they influence these farmers, other farmers in the community. And two out of our interviewed farmers also had consulting and extension role in addition to their farming role. So you're seeing this quote here, which describes this co-learning experience, how we also share the struggles too, right? The mistakes that we make in the field, in particular on this quote here, how cover crop termination timing might impact pests and diseases. How do we share that with other farmers in the community? And finally, how we meet stakeholders, farmers, where they are in their learning process, right? Some farmers, they are more systems thinkers than the other, how we tailor that communication so we are reaching different farmers in the community and meeting them where they are in the learning process. Finally, on-farm experimentation and adaptive management, especially in the context of social networks. Farmers, this quote here sharing the importance of teaching future generation of agriculture workforce on the importance of soil health. This other quote here, the importance of huge data and farmers network meeting, helpful to incentivize the adoption of other farmers. So you see the farmer mentioned here that the neighbors share with them pretty much due to that field day, they were going to try clover crops. So we see here how those field days and farm networking needs are important. And finally, long-term on-farm research. Usually in our community, we like to conduct long-term experiments, right? When we have time and resources. And I really like the quote of this farmer acknowledging the importance of long-term on-farm research in their field. So conducting research for 2, 3, 5 years, that's when they gain the most, what they said here, because you can see how that management performed in an average year, in a challenge year. So what the importance of co-learning and peer learning opportunities. Second, long-term on-farm research, also multi-location here, because soil health is type specific, so how can we also have more multi-location on-farm research? Third here, the educational approach for future generation of agriculture workforce. And finally, how we leverage all those networks of trusted professionals to meet technical, social, and experiential assistance needed related to soil health. All right, so I know it was a lot. How we distill all that information, right? So this is my attempt here. Bringing the main aspect of each of those on-farm types or research studies. First, cover crops have most of the weight in soil properties and can reduce fertilizer use when we consider those organic nitrogen pools in fertilizer recommendation. Also, cover crops close the soil health gap, but on-farm experiments must be sampled intentionally. And for those working within energy or with farmers, reference types can now be included as part of the conservation plan and the sampling aspect. So again, including here reference condition to try to understand more what is going on those on-farm sites. In terms of soil organic matter, those are very complex, and cover crops might not increase in the short term when we compare with our reference type. And finally, the importance of network-based approach for encouraging sustaining soil health management systems on farms. So those 5 different aspects that I mentioned in this last study that were important part in terms of social and informational networks. So I wanna thank you a few minutes here to thank you everybody for being here. I'm so excited to see this room full of people. For those connecting online, thank you so much for being with us. And it has been a long journey. I always tell that this is a collaborative process. I'm not here alone or by myself, and there are a lot of people involved here that I want to thank you all, starting with the committee members for all the support along this journey, the current and past members of the Resilient Cropping Systems Lab, all the collaborator farmers, those here with us today connecting online. Having this opportunity to work with farmers gave me even a deeper appreciation for the work they do. So thank you so much for that. The On-Farm Research Network support In particular, I want to thank here Laura Thompson and Nathan Mueller, also USDA and NRCS personnel for all the help and support with communicating with farmers, sampling, and all the support. Special thank you to Aaron here with us today. Our department, our institute, I'm very thankful. Now I understand the role of that, the true meaning of that saying there is no place like Nebraska, and certainly there is not. I'm very thankful for all those here. The water is Daughter Water for Food Global Institute for all the support, funding support, but also professional development opportunities. Our main scientific society for helping me to develop a lot of the leadership skills. And finally, the community here in Lincoln, the Nebraska International Student Fellowship, and all the community of friends, those here, and those connecting with us. Thank you so much. And finally, my family is supporting along all this way. I'm very thankful for them in Brazil, in Nebraska, and in Nicaragua. So thank you all for being here.
Fernanda, excellent work, excellent delivery. Congratulations to you. You represent your department very well. So thank you for the advice as well. I have a couple of questions, and I'm just going to go ahead and ask both of them here. One question relates to economics, right? And so you talked about cover crop, but you didn't talk about the main crop. Which is the source of income and revenue. So if you could talk a little bit about the effect of that trade-off, if there was any trade-off. The second question I have, in your study 2 and study 3, you alluded to, especially study 2, you alluded to the fact that you have more nitrogen with cover crop, right? And you could potentially reduce fertilizer input. What's the effect of having more nitrogen on the potential carbon sequestration? In this case, the stability of carbon in the soil. Is there a trade-off? You have more nitrogen. Does that mean you can potentially reduce, because you're gonna, so if you could talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha, for the questions. And so first one, in terms of the economic, that is very important when farmers considering adopting a lot of those practices, in particular cover crops here. We didn't have time to present the economic aspect, but as part of the On-Farm Research Network, we included on those annual reports that economic analysis. So when we look at for that particular year, corn yield, soybean yield, wheat yield, and the cover crop on that calculation. We had that as part of those on-farm reports that we did not present here. In general, we saw in terms of yield responses, it was both ranging from negative, neutral to positive effect. In some scenarios where we had the negative influence on cash crop yield, we did observe that impact on the economics, but I also think maybe as well on how we consider the economics of those, right? I think analyzing it as a one-year season might not be the ideal when we are considering those cover crops in more diversified rotation. So how can we think on an economic analysis on a 3-4 year period, right? Because I think that's when we will be able to quantify the benefits of those diversified seasons. So based on the responses we saw included in the On-Farm Research Network, we saw the range going from neutral to positive aspects. But here, I think it's important to consider thinking more innovative ways that we can calculate that return on investment on those on-farm trials. Nitrogen on carbon sequestration. Yeah, so on our first study, we saw that when we include more organic pools of nitrogen, we saw that reduction in fertilizer. But fertilizer I'm not saying here that they are not important. We need to include them. And especially when we look at previous studies, rates of nitrogen and how that affect, for example, root growth or of crop, there is that ideal or range where if we apply too much or too little, we are affecting our root growth. But how can we get to that that optimal nitrogen range, right? And that is something that we were not able to include as part of what we did in this study, but there are several other studies that look at how nitrogen affect different enzyme activities in the soil, especially those breaking out, looking at like lignin. So yeah, I don't know if that addressed completely your question, but I think that you're welcome.
It is 2, so if anyone has to go, please feel free to, but take a few more questions if we have any online or.
Thanks. My name is Aaron Hurd. I'm the NRCS representative. Thanks, Fernanda. This is a great presentation, and it's been a pleasure to work with you on this. Wonderful synopsis of the 4 studies that you covered today. I wanted to get a sense from you, because you've used soil health gap in this process, if you also got a sense of how that information resonated with the farmers themselves, and whether that was important to them, or if you could see that going a step further in helping them assess their adoption rate or perceived measurements of success primarily.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Aaron. Yeah, we in one of the updates meeting, we presented part of this work, the soil health gap, and I think what's interesting because at the end of the meeting, some farmers came and asked me, oh, so then how do I identify those reference sites? Because yeah, I'm trying in my field adopting cover crops, for example, how do I select a reference condition? So after presenting that on that farmers network meeting, I anecdotally saw that some farmers reaching out to me and trying to understand how do we identify those reference sites. So I think it's very promising way to help farmers measuring the success of their conservation plans on farms.
Thank you.
I have a question related with your first study. When you heard about the equation, have you seen anything related with or similar using your networks to take those index and do predictions of
You mean the first study on those indexes? Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, have you seen anything similar or trying to do like same thing with neural network?
Neural networks. So is that more related to the entomology effect of I'm trying to, I don't.
All right.
I don't.
They kind of use a system of mathematical algorithm
Uh-huh.
to take a couple of factors and use all of them to do predictions.
Oh, I see what you're, yeah, the our random forest is that, yeah, there are ways to explore that. Certainly, it's just, working on that very first chapter, there was a lot of challenges in terms of how do we make sense of that data, and we identified those indexes based on the literature, and we saw that they worked well, and we were able to quantify some of the benefits of cover crops and see what is going on. But having those random forest or other analysis, I think, can be the way to go too. Thank you, Fred.
Are there any questions online? Okay, well, it is a few minutes after 2, so I think we'll be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Fernanda, for great work and a great presentation. So please, on your way out.